It turns out that Ukraine is taking over more and more new territories, liberating them, which means it's winning. We just need to wait, and the goal of Russia's strategic defeat will be achieved.
Understood.
I am very pleased to welcome you again, Mr. President Lukashenko, my dear friend.
In all areas of economic development, Belarus uses your technologies, and we are satisfied with the level of these technologies.
An end to both sides striking deep into each other's territory.
While Vladimir Putin was speaking publicly today about negotiations with Ukraine, the Kremlin, after a closed meeting in Valdai, sent Lukashenko to China to meet with Xi Jinping. And now it becomes clear what the two dictators, the Russian and the Belarusian, have planned. Today, Vladimir Putin increased the number of his security guards for the fourth time since the start of the full-scale war. The rebel Alexander Lunin, who had promised to raise atoms. The army marching on Moscow was accused of extremism and even Nazism. Vladimir Putin, for the second time in a week, declared his readiness for peace talks on Ukraine after a record series of strikes on oil refineries and called on Donald Trump to return to the topic of Ukraine as soon as possible. Although I admitted that there really were no agreements in Anchorage last year. In addition, Putin said that Ukraine proposed that Russia refrain from long-range strikes on each other's territory and focus the war only on the front line, specifically in 4 regions. But of course, Putin did not provide any confirmation of this. And so, while talking about the situation at the front, Vladimir Putin imagined the encirclement of Ukrainian armed forces units near Stary Oskol and announced battles near Belgorod. At the same time, Vladimir Putin finally admitted the fuel shortage across all of Russia, but again downplayed the problem, saying that only certain types of gasoline are lacking. But right after that, Putin still issued a decree completely banning the export of any type of fuel, including diesel. Meanwhile, real raids have begun in Russian regions targeting Russians in search of Ukrainian saboteurs. Well, for example, in the Murmansk region, they blocked the highways leading into the city and are checking absolutely all vehicles. Well, it's no wonder Vladimir Putin admitted the day before that Ukrainian intelligence services are successfully recruiting, quote, Russian outcasts. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss all these topics together in detail. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and of course, don't forget to leave your comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video.
Vladimir, I want to say that in general, these strikes on our civilian infrastructure are carried out not only to cause us some kind of damage. Although I think this is also important for the enemy, it's also to fuel their information campaign. And maybe, to be more precise, it's not even a campaign, but an information operation as part of the confrontation with Russia, Vladimir Putin. At the very least, the goal is to make us doubt ourselves and our strength, and even better, to create division within Russian society, and to force Russia to at least temporarily halt the advance of our troops on the line of contact, and to create conditions for starting negotiations on terms that are favorable for themselves, meaning for our adversary.
So over the past day, Vladimir Putin has made a whole series of statements, and they all boil down to the claim that supposedly the Kremlin is once again ready for negotiations with Ukraine and is asking Trump to return to this topic. But in reality, the Kremlin is clearly plotting something together with Beijing and Minsk, and we will discuss exactly what that is. But let's take it step by step. Vladimir Putin has stated for the second time in the past week that Russia is ready to resume negotiations with representatives of the United States of America about ending the war in Ukraine. Here is his quote. "We are expecting, after the hot phase on the Iran track is over, the arrival of those representatives of the US administration with whom we have already met in Moscow more than once. And we are ready to continue negotiations and discuss all the details and modalities of, if not agreements, then at least the issues under discussion." Here, there is a hint at Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who have already flown to Moscow for a meeting. Well, Stephen Witkoff has already had several meetings with Putin. At the same time, the president of the Russian Federation confirmed that at the summit with the American leader Donald Trump in Anchorage, which took place in August last year, the parties really did not reach any concrete agreements. However, according to the bold dictator, certain possibilities for ending the war were discussed as well as compromises. Another quote from Putin: "They proposed that we make compromises there. We thought about it, not right away, but we came to Anchorage and said, yes, we agree. We haven't heard any other position from the American side, from the American administration." What's interesting here is that if Russians had a bit of brains, they would ask themselves, wait, then what were Ushakov, Lavrov, Peskov, Medvedev and all those guys talking about all this time? They were talking about some kind of spirit of Anchorage, about some agreements in Alaska and so on. But Putin once again shoves these unwashed Russians' faces into their own mess and says, oh right, there were no agreements. Wait, what agreements? He says, well, we talked about something there, but there were no agreements. That's how all Russians are. They can lie as much as they want. They'll make up legends. When caught and confronted, they're asked, what agreements? Marco Rubio said there were no agreements, just proposals. Then the Russian calmly replies, yes, there weren't any. Who said there were agreements? And were there? No one ever said there were any agreements. And it's telling that the statement by the Russian president about being ready for negotiations on Ukraine was already the second one this week. And it came against the backdrop of a growing fuel crisis in the country due to Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries. Before that, on June 23, Putin stated that he was ready to discuss ending the hostilities based on the Istanbul agreements, as well as taking into account the modalities discussed in Anchorage and the realities on the ground. At the same time, he emphasized that Ukraine's attacks on civilian infrastructure will not affect what is happening at the front in any way. Quote from Putin: "Everything that is being done in this direction is now being done in order to create favorable conditions for themselves in case of the start or resumption of peace negotiations, which were interrupted at Ukraine's initiative from a so-called position of strength." In other words, that bold excuse for a man, Vladimir Putin fully understands what's happening. But Putin also assured Russians for a long time that there were no serious consequences for them from Ukrainian drone attacks. He says, well, yes, something hits the oil refinery, but we repair it in just 10 minutes and the plant is up and running again. But the day before, Putin finally admitted there really is a shortage of gasoline. Vladimir Putin admitted on Sunday evening that problems with fuel supplies have led to what he called a non-critical shortage, and said that a special task force is working to ensure there are sufficient fuel supplies across the country. A special task force. Putin claimed there were no issues a week ago, but now a special task force is addressing it. Here's a quote from Putin.
As for strikes on critically important infrastructure in general and on energy infrastructure in particular, of course, these strikes on our infrastructure facilities do create problems. That's obvious. Right now we're seeing a certain shortage, but it's not critical. I'll explain. There are several tasks we need to solve here, and we've just discussed this with my colleagues. The first task is to quickly and significantly increase the production of the most in-demand air defense systems. As I already said, there is some damage, but all the damaged facilities are being restored fairly quickly, and the problems that arise are not of a critical nature. Everything here is operating steadily and with a large margin of safety.
Putin held a meeting on Sunday about ensuring fuel supply for the domestic market, where he said that Russia must minimize the consequences of Ukrainian drone strikes on oil facilities, which have become one of the causes of this shortage. And just a week ago, after Putin stated that Ukrainian drones cause no damage, that air defense protects everyone, and that all Russians are under a protective dome. And even if there are strikes, they're nothing more than mosquito bites, nothing serious. But now Putin says the following, quote, well, listen, you know very well that problems remain for both drivers and businesses. And unfortunately, there are still lines at gas stations and you can't always find the right type of gasoline. This is once again repeating what I mentioned a little earlier. An average Russian, someone like Putin, at first says with a straight face, there are no consequences at all, it's all in your imagination, there's no shortage. Then, when he's confronted and shown the truth, he says, oh well, it's obvious, of course there are problems. Just compare these two lines of rhetoric for yourself. Putin a week ago, Putin today. Putin a week ago says no problems. Putin now says, "What do you mean? It's obvious there are problems, but you can see for yourself that there are problems. What kind of questions are you asking me?" And again, pay attention to the fact that this is being said by the president of a country that's commonly called a gas station. Russians, are you sure your war is really going according to plan? In the end, Putin reported that the Russian Federation is already using its strategic gasoline reserves, which currently amount to 1.7 million tons. He also added that they are considering a ban on exports of not only gasoline but also diesel fuel. And now China and India are emerging as the main candidates to supply fuel to Russia, which purchase Russian oil. But the problem is that fuel imported from farther abroad will be significantly more expensive than supplies from Russian producers. According to Reuters estimates, in June, fuel production in Russia dropped by 25% year on year and is now about 20% below domestic consumption. Well, no one is even talking about imports at all. Out of the largest oil refineries, only one in all of Russia has not been hit in the past 2 months and continues to operate at full capacity. This is the Omsk oil refinery with a capacity of 22 million tons per year. Well, I think the Ukrainian Defense Forces know when and how to strike this refinery too. And against this backdrop, Vladimir Putin is claiming today that he is ready for talks on Ukraine and even stated that Ukraine has given him a peace proposal. According to him, Ukraine proposed that both sides stop long-range strikes on each other's territory and focus the fighting on the front line. Here's a quote from Putin. "It's clear why this proposal is being made, because our retaliatory strikes deep into Ukrainian territory are more powerful, painful, and frankly destructive. Let me point out right away, when the bold blunder, Vladimir Putin, says he's carrying out retaliatory strikes, that's a cynical lie. In this situation, only Ukraine can carry out retaliatory strikes because Russia was the initiator of the war. It was Russia that started this war. It was Russia that attacked Ukraine. It was Russia that was the first to strike Ukraine. Accordingly, everything that comes from Ukraine to Russia is a retaliatory strike. Everything that comes from Russia to Ukrainian territory is an act of aggression, not a retaliatory strike." Also, according to him, Kiev put forward an initiative to restrict military actions only to the 4 territories occupied by the Russian army: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions. Well, supposedly. Thus, Ukraine wants to withdraw its troops from the Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kherson regions, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, as well as from some sections of the state border, and to redeploy these units to the 4 aforementioned regions, says Putin. But according to the bald dwarf, Russia will not agree to this and confirmed that his plans have not changed. He says, "We need to liberate Donbas and Novorossiya." And here it was funny to hear Vladimir Putin once again claim that all Ukrainian strikes deep into Russia have absolutely no effect on anything. Next, another quote from him. "Strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine on Russian infrastructure create problems and lead to a certain fuel shortage. But all the damaged facilities are restored fairly quickly, and everything is functioning normally. All the strikes, no matter where they are carried out, have absolutely no impact on the situation at the front on the line of contact." Well, and in order for everyone to believe that Russia is really winning, Vladimir Putin made up some kind of encirclement of Ukrainian armed forces units today. In the area of Stary Oskol, remember this name, Stary Oskol, and apparently he also announced battles near Belgorod. Ukrainian military responded to such a statement by Vladimir Putin, and the military noted that as of now, they're only working on advancing in this direction. That's sarcasm, and you'll understand why in a moment. And the report about the encirclement of the Ukrainian armed forces near the Stary Oskol area is yet another fake from the Kremlin. A Russian, being rather dim-witted, likely won't check the information. And in the statement from the armed forces of Ukraine, it says, quote, "We are convinced that the head of the Russian Federation knows the combat capability of his troops better than we do, so we suggest considering the battles for Stary Oskol as something he himself is announcing." This refers to Vladimir Putin's statement that Russian troops have allegedly almost blocked the Ukrainian group on the left bank of the Stary Oskol River. But in reality, there is simply no river with that name. Stary Oskol is a city in the Belgorod region of the Russian Federation, which is located more than 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Well, and probably the head of the Kremlin confused the city with the Oskol River, which flows in the Kharkiv region, where fighting is still ongoing. Ukrainian armed forces soldiers say, that must have been an announcement. Now we're focused on reaching Stary Oskol. Nevertheless, in the Kremlin, they are still looking for options to resume negotiations with Donald Trump in order to try once again to block Ukraine's attacks on Russia. And for this, Vladimir Putin is trying to play the Belarus card through Lukashenko himself. Let me remind you, earlier Lukashenko left Belarus, and later it became known that he spent the night with Vladimir Putin at his residence in Valdai. They spent that night so privately, tete-a-tete. And the details of the meeting were never announced. There were no statements at all about this secret night meeting, although later, Kremlin press secretary Dmitry Peskov stated that the two old dictators negotiated for several hours tete-a-tete, starting at night, then slept, and continued the negotiations in the morning. And here let me remind you that before this night meeting, Lukashenko told Russian ambassador Gryzlov to his face that Belarus should not be dragged into the war. He also added that he supposedly received representatives of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Minsk before his trip to see Putin in Valdai. And now there are rumors that Lukashenko might be used as a liaison between Kyiv and Moscow. But today, Dmitry Peskov refused to answer the question of whether Alexander Lukashenko is a communication channel between Ukraine and Russia, considering that he recently met with Zelensky's representative in Minsk. Next is a quote from Peskov. In order for these existing channels to work and function, they need to remain in the shadows, they need to remain non-public, so I will not answer your question. But of course, the topic of Ukraine was present in the agenda of the informal talks that took place on Friday and Saturday at Valdai between Putin and Lukashenko. Well, apparently Peskov must have been there in person after all. Next, Lukashenko. Well, apparently Peskov must have been there in person after all. Then Lukashenko suddenly dropped off the radar completely. On Sunday, it was completely unknown where he went. Well, Lukashenko disappeared somewhere. And today, June 29, the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko showed up in China. In Beijing, he even managed to meet with the head of China, Xi Jinping. In the morning, Lukashenko's plane landed at Beijing capital airport Shudu. Subsequently, the official meeting between the Belarusian dictator and the head of China began.
Describe Lukashenko as somnolent.
Describe Lukashenko as somnolent.
And now Xi Jinping has stated that, quote, right now Chinese-Belarusian relations are at a historic peak. Lukashenko responded to this by saying that he greatly appreciates such a positive assessment of the relations between Minsk and Beijing, and according to the Belarusian dictator, he and China's leader will negotiate global cooperation.
I flew here from the Moscow region. We were negotiating with President Putin, and after that, I flew to Beijing.
崇拜亮挂
China and Belarus are ironclad friends, and we are developing a comprehensive strategic partnership.
In Belarus, we built the Great Stone together with you, and I am grateful to you for supporting the recent years, following the initiative for the development of industry and industrial cooperation between our two countries. In all areas of economic development, Belarus uses your technologies, and we are satisfied with the level of these technologies.
And this is where the feeling arises that all these loud public statements by Lukashenko to Gryzlov's face, saying that Belarus should not be dragged into the war, were just a circus or a theatrical performance. The fact is that China can quite possibly help Belarus set up weapons production on its territory, which will then be used for the needs of the Russian army. And here I have something to tell you. The most striking example of close technological cooperation with China is the Belarusian Polonez multiple launch rocket system. Lukashenko calls this weapon exclusively Belarusian, but in practice this system uses Chinese missiles, and only the launcher itself is mounted on a Belarusian-made chassis. So, in fact, it's a completely Chinese system on Belarusian wheels. But what's much more dangerous for Ukraine is this. In recent years, it is the Belarusian military-industrial complex that has shifted its focus to the development of unmanned technologies, electronic warfare systems, and interceptor drones. On the basis of platforms like the Great Stone China-Belarus Industrial Park, joint projects are being implemented to create unmanned systems, electronics, and targeting systems. And what's important is that this is happening right now. Belarus, together with China, is trying to set up production of those very interceptor drones on Belarusian territory in order to effectively counter Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow. Lukashenko's secret trip to Putin and then to Xi Jinping may have been connected to exactly this. In other words, the Kremlin is planning to involve Belarus in the war in this way, to set up weapons production on its territory, primarily interceptor drones, as confirmation that Ukraine will not attack these so-called Belarusian factories. But in the meantime, Putin has started to get paranoid. The Russian president has really become more afraid for his own skin. It is reported that Vladimir Putin has increased the number of personnel in the central office of the Federal Protective Service for the 4th time since the war began. According to the text of Putin's new decree, the maximum number of government civilian employees in the central office of the Federal Protective Service should increase from the current 785 to 812 people. Let me remind you, the Federal Protective Service is responsible for protecting top officials, primarily President Vladimir Putin and the Prime Minister, as well as their family members. Previously, informed sources told the Financial Times that in recent months the service has sharply increased security measures around the body of Telts, or more precisely, Vladimir Putin, and according to them, concerns have grown in the Kremlin that Putin could become the target of an assassination attempt, especially using drones or during an attempted coup. Putin's fears intensified after the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by the American military. He then scaled back all his visits, and the screening of people who meet with him became even stricter. During his official visit to Kazakhstan at the end of May, Vladimir Putin's motorcade was accompanied by an armored car with a spot for a machine gunner on the roof, a vehicle equipped with electronic warfare systems, and a helicopter. So Vladimir Putin is really afraid that some drone might target his bald head. Also, Putin and his family have stopped appearing at residences in Moscow and Valdai, preferring more secluded places instead. They spend weeks in bunkers, including in Karaganda and Krasnodar Krai. According to sources from the Financial Times, the additional security measures are not limited to Vladimir Putin. The Federal Protective Service has also been instructed to strengthen the security of 10 high-ranking generals of the Ministry of Defense, including 3 deputies of Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, who until recently was the only military leader under such protection. All these actions were a response to a series of assassination attempts on Russian generals by Ukrainian intelligence services. But that's not all. Do you remember the story about the Russian occupier who was preparing a rebellion against Moscow? So, the Russian occupier Alexander Lunin, who recorded a video address to Vladimir Putin warning about the threat of a military rebellion, was arrested on charges of displaying extremist and, get this, Nazi symbols. Moreover, despite all his wife's statements that he supposedly went to Moscow, it became known that on June 27, Alexander Lunin was tried in the Rossoshansky district court of the Voronezh region. Earlier, the wife of the savage occupier Lunin recorded a video in which she said that on the night of June 27, their house in the village of Lizinovka, Voronezh region, was searched. According to her, the police seized computer equipment, flash drives, laptops, and other items. Lunin himself was not at home, and he stated that they contacted him. President Putin's administration contacted Lunin and invited him to a meeting in Moscow, so Lunin went to Moscow and stopped getting in touch. And after that, his wife deleted all the videos from social media. And it turned out that this rebel was simply convicted for displaying Nazi symbols. Ironic, isn't it? A Russian occupier who went to Ukraine supposedly to fight Ukrainian Nazis was accused of that very Nazism in a Russian court. That's how it turns out. And that's the whole point. Russians are pushovers and cowards. Let me remind you, Lunin published his address to Putin on June 25. He talked about the command using torture and violence against soldiers for refusing to follow, quote, stupid suicidal orders, as well as for refusing to give their money to the command. Lunin warned that if President Putin does not meet with him personally, and if he is not allowed to speak on television, the army will turn its weapons against the Kremlin. And as of the time this episode was recorded, his video on the social network Instagram had reached 18 million views. But of course, no rebellion happened. Why? Well, because let me repeat once again, Russians are cowards and pushovers. But in Russia, they launched a mass search for Ukrainian saboteurs. In the Murmansk region, on the federal highway R21, they started checking all vehicles heading toward the regional capital. They cut off communication and internet at the region's entrance. On Monday morning, the Murmansk operational headquarters confirmed these total inspections and stated that yes, everyone entering the Murmansk region is being checked. Several roads are blocked, and on top of that, there are huge traffic jams. Earlier, on June 27, the authorities of the Murmansk region warned residents of areas bordering Finland and Norway about the activity of foreign sabotage and reconnaissance groups. In reality, the Kremlin was afraid of a repeat of the Ukrainian Operation Spiderweb, during which drones hidden in trucks attacked Russian strategic military airfields, including the Olenya air base in that very Murmansk region. And now it has become known that the nuclear submarines of the Russian Northern Fleet in the Murmansk region have been covered with anti-drone nets. Putin is afraid. He is afraid. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you know how to do it. You can donate using the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate your support. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.